Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Megan Lawson, and I'm an economist with Headwaters Economics. I'm particularly excited to be presenting to this group. Right now, I'm based in Bozeman, Montana, but prior to living here, I lived in Rollinsville in Netherlands for a decade. So the place that you all are working on is near and dear to my heart. So Headwaters Economics is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. Our mission is to provide information, data, and analysis to communities to help them make well-informed decisions about the most pressing problems that they face. Our research focuses around economic development, land and natural resource management, and natural hazard mitigation like wildfire and flooding. And I am Headwaters research lead on public lands and outdoor recreation. Just to give you a quick little roadmap over my presentation, I'm going to set the stage talking about trends and demographics and land use, then talk a little bit about the NoCo economy and what drives it, and then connect that to public lands and how the economy is in the NoCo region is closely tied to its public lands, and then finally talk a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting some of these trends that we're seeing. So this is coming as no surprise to anyone on the call that the NoCo region is growing. Most of this is from in-migration and folks moving to the area. But what might come as a surprise is it's growing even faster than the rest of Colorado, which is already one of the faster growing regions, faster growing states in the country. So the population pressures that you all are seeing is not imagined, it's intense. So with all that growth, we're seeing land use change. So a lot of that pressure is on, we're seeing in that 43% of land that is private. We're also seeing trends in when residential development is happening, those parcels that are being developed are bigger and bigger. So more acres are being used per person. When you combine that with all the population growth in the previous slide, we're seeing a lot of sprawl. And so that's what's happening on the private land. On that 57% of land that's public, as folks were already talking about in those the land management agencies, that's translating into a lot of increased recreation pressure on those public lands. And I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail. I'm an economist. I have to talk about the economy and how it's really dramatically transformed here. Looking at this chart on the vertical axis is trillions of dollars of personal income. On the horizontal axis, it's years since 1970 up to 2018, the most recent year for which we have data. So the bottom, I'm just going to go kind of from the bottom to the top in terms of talking about these different lines and trends. The bottom orange line is personal income from government employment. That generally tends to follow population growth. The next line up is non-services, and you can see those really, that includes construction, manufacturing, extractive industries like mining, oil and gas, it includes agriculture. And those really were in line with other parts of the economy until about 1990. And after that, it's kind of plateaued in large part because just the productivity on those sectors has increased so much. So you don't need the same number of workers to produce the same amount of goods and the same amount of value. So that's really resulted in kind of flatlining of the non-services sector. I'm going to switch over to services, that top line, that dark red. When folks think of services, a lot of times their minds go first to low-wage services, flipping burgers, making beds, bumping lifts, and that kind of thing. But services is really a very expansive category. In the NoCo region, the biggest section of component of services is high-wage, professional, technical, and scientific, and also healthcare. So it's really very expansive, and it's really what's driving a lot of the growth. The green line I want to spend a moment on is non-labor income. So non-labor income is income from sources besides from your job. Includes investments, which is the biggest component in this region. It also includes payments related to aging, like Medicare and Social Security. And it also includes hardship-related payments, like food stamps, Medicaid, and unemployment benefits. In this area, it's 37% of all personal income. And I really want to highlight this because it'll come in later. And it's sort of a hidden part of the economy. It's not obvious. We used to call it the mailbox economy when the checks came in the mail. But it's a hidden but really important part of what's driving the economy in this. So I want to pause here and tell you a little bit about Headwaters' perspective on rural economic development and how it happens. Starts with agriculture and resources extraction most often. Inevitably, the tourists will come, which then leads to improvements in transportation infrastructure, roads, highways, and most importantly, airports. And those places that are connected to bigger metropolitan areas through airports, those are the ones in the West that we see growing the fastest. Their economies look a lot more like big cities than isolated rural places. And so once we see that connectivity through airports and infrastructure, we then start seeing an amenity migration economy. And that leads to economic diversification. And so remember that non-labor income that I was talking about in the previous slide. When you have a lot of non-labor income, that is a sure sign that you have a big influx of these amenity migrants. So that's definitely what's going on in the NoCo area. So how does this all relate to public lands? Public lands are essential to all those steps in the economic development process. So they're essential to the extraction, they're essential to tourism, and they're essential to amenity migration. They're really the backbone for economic development in Colorado for a long time. Public lands economically provide lots to people. Among other things, it's commodity production, it's outdoor recreation, it improves folks' quality of life, which helps communities recruit businesses, and that in turn helps those businesses recruit talent and new employees. So as a result, we see places with a lot of federal lands outperforming places with little federal lands. So this chart in the yellow, it shows counties, this is west-wide, shows counties with the least amount of federal land. The green bars show counties with the most amount of federal land. And you can see in terms of population, employment, and personal income, we've seen dramatic increases in outperformance for places with a lot of federal land.
Thanks, Megan, and that's 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And so these communities, as remember back to that economic development theory, with amenity migration, these places are becoming more and more dependent on recreation to drive their economies. And from our research at Headwaters, we know that recreation counties have seen a lot more in-migration. And those folks moving to those places bring jobs, income, and have been helping wages to grow. But we all know there's a dark side of recreation dependence. These places are expensive. In the NoCo region, 1 out of every $3 earned is spent on housing. We know that there's significant impacts to ecological impacts on wildlife and water. And culturally and economically, we know that a cowboy is not equivalent to a mountain biker. And so some of those transitions remain very challenging for these recreation counties. And then finally, this little outhouse. We know community budgets, federal land payments like PILT and SRS, and revenue sharing mechanisms from federal land have been designed around resource extraction, not recreation. So as folks were alluding to, how do federal agencies fund the services like trailheads and outhouses? And then how does a community like Estes Park, a city of 6,000, fund a sewer system to service the 4.6 million visitors to Rocky Mountain National Park. There's some really significant challenges. And the pandemic has certainly highlighted these. Obviously, a tremendous amount of uncertainty around the pandemic and what's going to happen. But as folks were talking about, there's been a significant increase in recreation demands of public land, especially front country and areas near communities. We're also seeing accelerated migration to rural places, driving up housing prices and exacerbating some of those underlying cost of living challenges. So in sum, NoCo is booming and changing, driven by amenity migration, a shift to high wage services and non-labor income. And public lands play a huge role in this transition. That's why people are moving here. It brings a lot of good economic opportunity, but it also brings with it a lot of challenges, particularly around agency budgets and county and city budgets that aren't necessarily set up to accommodate this shift. Sorry, I went to touch over, and that's
No, you did great. Thanks, Megan, for kind of setting that bar for folks of really keeping it close to 10, and also for delivering a lot of fantastic information in that short time. We appreciate it. We're going to turn to Tom, and once again, if that seemed to work for folks, I'll set my timer for 8, and then again at the 10-minute mark, just so you can hear that buzzer.
I'm Tom St. Hilaire with the Pew Charitable Trust, and we're a global research and public policy organization. Specifically, I'm with the Restore America's Parks campaign, which is part of our environment program. And the idea of developing this campaign was to deal with the deferred maintenance in the National Park Service and the National Park System, as well as implement long-term solutions to address the challenge. And let's see here. Oh, good. Just a little background. We did a lot of research on the campaign before we started. It was right before the centennial of the National Park Service. And so there was a lot of commissions that were established, and a lot of ideas for how the Park Service could make it into the second century or survive into the second century. And we looked through a lot of different issues. And the way Pew operates is we kind of look at the issues, we call them orphan issues, those issues that other folks aren't working on, or who may need some boost or something like that. And so we came upon deferred maintenance, which is has to be the least sexy issue you would ever want to work on in the environmental community. But we're Pew and we're data driven, so we're happy to do stuff like that. It's $11.9 billion. And so we thought, okay, what are the different funding mechanisms that we can look at? And we looked at very park specific ones. There was the FLORIA, which is the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act, which is the authorization for entrance fees and fees at national parks and other federal lands. We were looking to see if we could increase that. We looked at concessioners. Concessioners pay a fee to have their hotels, et cetera, in national parks. And we were looking to see if we could increase franchise fees for that. We looked at the gas tax with the Surface Transportation Bill. We looked at a visa tax, a tax on people coming into this country for vacations. We looked on a tax, a national tax on outdoor recreation equipment, which for those of you who are around 25 years ago, when that started, it wasn't very successful. So we decided not to go with that. We looked at other things like real estate tax, park improvement districts, a lot of ideas from state and local parks that really weren't transferable to the National Park Service and the National Park System, but still gave us ideas of where we might go. We ended up landing on a dedicated funding source through the oil and gas revenues. Just as the Land and Water Conservation Fund derives its revenue from Outer Continental Shelf land and water, I'm sorry, oil and gas revenues, we decided to go with that. In the end, we came up with a bill, the Restore our Parks bill. At the same time, the Land and Water Conservation Fund folks were doing their own campaign to get dedicated funding for their program, which is about 50 years old, probably one of the most important conservation programs ever developed in the country. You know, we decided in the end that the funding source wasn't as important. So that's probably not a lesson learned for you guys. But the federal government over the last 6 months, well, if you start with the tax cut in 2017, and then the pandemic measures, the COVID responses and stimulus, none of that's been offset or had to have a pay for, which is what they normally have in Congress. And so that was one of the things that helped us along in terms of getting this passed. And as people mentioned earlier, the Great American Outdoors Act was passed a couple weeks ago. We're very pleased with that. The bulk of that deferred maintenance money is going to go to the Park Service, but other federal agencies will also get that as well. I wanted to quickly talk about when we started the campaign, and we did these focus groups with very conservative people and said, we have $11.9 billion in deferred maintenance with the National Park System. What do we do? And even the most conservative members, people would say, we'll just fund it, just have Congress fund it. Or we shouldn't, get rid of one jet fighter plane or something. Even the most conservative people would say that because people love national parks and they love it, and that also translates to other public lands, both at the state and the federal level and the local level. But they didn't quite get the numbers. That you really need to tell a story. So if you're going to start talking about funding NoCo, you have to explain to people what that issue really is. And so we did with the Park Service. There's 75,000 assets across the system. We started talking about, well, there's 28,000 buildings. That would be historic buildings like John Adams' house, Abraham Lincoln's house, Martin Luther King's boyhood home. When you start telling stories about that, then people start understanding that. When you talk about water and wastewater systems, people are like, ugh. But when you say that in Grand Canyon, there's $300 million in deferred maintenance for the water system, for the pipe that goes from the North Rim to the South Rim, and if that breaks down any further, then it could mean that people can't visit the South Rim because there's no potable water there. So we started telling stories about that. And we thought it was very important to do that because members of Congress, as much as their constituents would say, well, just fund the $11.9 billion, there's a disconnect between their constituents and sometimes how they vote in Congress. And so these were the ones that we really had to tell the story to. And then the three areas that we looked at in terms of giving a reason why this needed to be funded is because of aging infrastructure. The last time the Park Service had any sort of funding coming in was 50 years ago during Mission 66, which was the Park Service's 50-year anniversary. Visitation pressures, we've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years, skyrocketing visitation, and we're seeing it now with the pandemic. Then inconsistent funding from Congress, which is basically where Park Service gets most of its money, although it does get some donations and it uses fees and other things as well. We decided that you can't just talk about funding opportunity. You can't just talk about, okay, let's get rid of this $11.9 billion, get the money from Congress and be done with it. In order to sell the campaign, we had to talk about it in terms of other areas too, in terms of getting rid of some of the maintenance. So what we did was take a look at, well, what does the Park Service have? Is all that $11.9 billion in deferred maintenance really necessary? So we looked at 3 different areas, and we did a report with AECOM. So I'm just going to basically go over the generate new revenue. There's 3 areas that we looked at. We looked at transfer, eliminate deferred maintenance. We looked at generating new revenue. We looked at addressing future deferred maintenance. And the generate, if you count all of those together, it was $3.7 billion out of the $11.9 billion that we thought that we could deal with outside of the funding. So the first one, as I mentioned, is transfer, eliminate deferred maintenance. You can read the report. I think that was put, Jonathan may have put the report on the resources page. If not, we can get it to you. So I won't get into the specifics of a lot of these, but it's sort of privatizing utilities. A lot of these are just ideas, so don't get upset about something that we're going to push through. They're just ideas, and they all need further research. But looking at management of connector roads is an idea. If the Park Service has a road that's really connecting to towns, and oftentimes it does in rural areas, maybe it's time that someone else took over maintenance of those roads. Returning to nature, low priority roads and trails. There's some of that. The generate new revenue is the one I wanted to really focus on. These are some of them are controversial. You provide virtual or augmented reality experiences at battlefields, so people would pay extra money to do that. You provide augmented reality virtual ranger app at parks, which would be like $1 a piece, and you could do that. You could look at looking at ranger experiences and offering customized, people would pay more for customized ranger experiences. Tolling, which can be very controversial, especially for those of us in the Washington, D.C. area where a lot of the parkways are, but that can bring in a lot of money. And then finally, the other two I wanted to focus on was like dynamic pricing. If you look at, everyone knows that a lot of the visitation comes during the summer months. You could increase the pricing during the summer months and increase the revenue by $676 million. Enhance volunteering. I think if we really think that more research needs to go into that, because if you put a lot more money into, we know it's going to be money up front to sort of manage it, but we do think that volunteering can bring in a lot of money. And then digital fundraising is another areas. And then finally, we to address future deferred maintenance needs, we looked at different types of durability of roads and roofs and different types of asphalts and things like that. I won't get into that as much. Finally, in terms of looking at this campaign, you have to understand, is it a congressional campaign? Are you going to have to work with members of Congress to get this funding? Are you going to have to get memorandums or memoranda of agreements with the Forest Service and the Park Service, probably, and the state and local counties, so it's administrative? Are you going to have to work specifically with the Park Service or the Forest Service? We had to look at the director's orders and all of that because we were focusing on the Park Service. But I think in the end, it's important to understand that when you're looking at funding, it's a much larger issue than just the funding itself. You have to tell the story. You have to make sure that you're willing to cut costs in certain areas too. You can't just say, here's how much money we need for NoCo and all the parks in it. You're going to have to let people know that, we're going to have to cut some services. We're going to have to be more strategic in terms of where we spend our monies. And I'll just leave it right there.
Thanks so much, Tom. Really interesting to hear about how you motivate and message on those priorities and the rationale for the funding. Again, if folks have questions, you can jot them into chat now or just save them for when we do our panel discussion. But for now, we'll turn to David at Trust for Public Land.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me to this. I'm David Weinstein. I'm the Western Conservation Finance Director for the Trust for Public Land. If you're not familiar with TPL, we're a national nonprofit conservation organization working to create parks and protect land for people. And we've got about 27 offices around the country. I too, along with Megan, am based here in Bozeman, but I'm a native of Boulder, Colorado, and proud to say so. Only I get in trouble around here if I do say so. And so this is also near and dear to my heart. Our conservation finance program is set up for the creation and protection of public funding for conservation at its core. We are a lean and mean staff working to generate money at the local level to leverage a lot of the federal sources that we've heard about today. Primarily at the ballot box and primarily at the municipal and county levels. When the right coalition and the right needs come together, we work at the statewide level, either at the ballot box or through legislative efforts. And the reason that we do this work is really because of these numbers. The big caveat here is, again, the excitement of the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act a couple weeks ago, and what that will mean for that pie graph at the bottom. But, you know, between 98 and 2017, we saw firmly, you know, close to 80% of all public funding for conservation of land and water was generated at the state and local level. Obviously, there's a lot more guardrails and a lot of diversity of funding that occurs specifically at the local level. But we set up this program more than 20 years ago because of the power of these numbers. And this kind of busy graph shows a bit of a track record. I'd alert your eyes first to the peaks and valleys, that gray bar. It's a look at funding that's been created year in, year out in this 20-year span by the millions. And a couple things to point out there. One, you can see all the peaks happen to occur on even numbered years. This is largely because of voter turnout in those midterm elections and presidential years. Propensity of more voter turnout generally helps all piggy bank measures that we've found. And also you can see external factors here at play, specifically the Great Recession. And it does beg the question about what's going to happen as we, you know, continue to deal with this pandemic and the economic fallout. But we saw the numbers drop precipitously after 2009 there, before the something of an outlier in 2014, which that was the year that Florida, Maine, and California all passed statewide measures, creating that big spike. The blue bars here, though, are encouraging. That is the percentage of passage of measures. So in good times and bad, voters tend to pass conservation ballot measures to the tune of 75% or more, which is really encouraging. And I will just say anecdotally, so far, since March, since all of our lockdowns began, all the measures that the Trust for Public Land have been involved in have passed, and we're still seeing really good polling throughout the country. It remains to be seen what's going to happen next year, and as we really approach fiscal cliffs for state and local budgets. But time and again, we found that voters are far out ahead of their elected officials when it comes to spending money on conservation purposes. Obviously, this is no surprise to those of you on the Colorado Front Range. One other thing to point out contextually about this work, this is the 2016 presidential electoral map. And on the same election that Donald Trump won, we saw measures pass in all of these local jurisdictions. So, you know, TPL is also nonpartisan, and we like to say these are not red issues or blue issues, these are green issues. This has a lot to do with local folks talking about their backyards and what they're willing to tax themselves at to generate funding. And then one more map. Again, you're all familiar, obviously, with the Great Outdoors Colorado and the Conservation Trust Fund, but there's a cascading effect, right, from the federal, state, and local levels. The more dedicating funding you have at every jurisdiction, the more incentivization is going on at each jurisdiction. And so obviously the best programs are those that have written in a mandatory match for dedicated funding. And we always point to, you know, Washington State, Colorado, and then out east, you know, Massachusetts has the Community Preservation Act. And then there's a strong program in New Jersey that incentivizes all of that local generation of funding. And then just a pitch for the Trust for Public Land. We're hopeful that we could play a role in helping the efforts of NoCo, and we're proud of these numbers. 82% of the time that we get involved in ballot measures, the state and local level, we're successful, and we've helped jurisdictions generate nearly $80 billion over the years. So as I've talked to some of the NoCo members about, you know, these at the core, this is kind of what I'm looking for in order to establish some funding. You know, number one, elected leadership, right? We presumably folks have been put into office because they've got the trust of the community, and hopefully that trust is maintained. And so at best, you're looking for support coming from the bully pulpit, and at worst neutrality. It gets really difficult when elected leaders start speaking out against your measures. We do deal in citizen petitions occasionally. You know, obviously, for the most part, those presuppose an effort that elected leadership does not want. And so that can be challenging both to get the thing passed as well as the long-term, you know, the longevity of a measure. We're seeing in Florida, which was a citizen petition effort that led to that big victory in 2014, the state legislature continuously trying to poach funding after 75% of the state voted yes. Here in Montana, we're a bit behind Colorado when it comes to marijuana, but we just got recreational marijuana onto the ballot. And of the 20% of tax on that, we're going to see half of that money going toward conservation. The big fear here, of course, is the legislature is going to try to poach that or prevent that funding if it gets passed. Number two is that demonstrable need. This kind of speaks to what Tom was talking about, telling the story. You really need to be very clear with your voters about what they're going to get, what's at risk, and what the reward will be if you're asking them to tax themselves. And then finally is that community support. That's what's really heartening about the NoCo Coalition. You've got that in spades. You know, I'm one of two people that works on this for TPL throughout the West, and I'm only local in, you know, my Parks and Trails district and Bozeman and Gallatin County and the state of Montana. And that kind of, again, presupposes that I'm an outsider every time I'm doing this work. So we're always looking for a strong coalition to carry the water of a campaign. And then finally, I always cheat in throwing terrific ballot language, and I'll get into why. And then this is a bit of just our process to give you all a sense. Thanks, Julie. You know, we start with, sometimes this is a year-long project of doing feasibility research, depending on the size of the jurisdiction, but we help communities, you know, investigate their finance options, their fiscal capacity. We look at various measures and what those will cost the average household so that we can start informing our polling work. We look at election requirements and ballot language requirements and the pathways to get to the ballot so that we're not missing any important compliance issues. And then sometimes we build in best practices and a bit of an election history into that feasibility research. From there, feasibility also goes a long way in beginning the building of a coalition if one doesn't already exist. From there, we get into public opinion research, and you know, I don't need to go into the machinations of polling. At the end of the day, the why of polling is to ensure that your electorate is aligned with you know, the will of your coalition, of staff, and of elected officials, and to understand the tax tolerance within a community, as well as an alignment of conservation priorities. I'll skip programmatic recommendations for now, but that's basically, you know, we're about to hear from Robin about various funding mechanisms. You just want to make sure that you're not focusing time and energy on a funding mechanism that's not going to deliver the kind of funding you need to achieve the conservation priorities that you've identified. I'll pause a bit on ballot language. We harp on this, and you know, over the 20 years of doing this work, we found that it doesn't matter how well funded a campaign is, it doesn't matter how much voter communication you're doing. There's really only one thing that we know you're going to 100% guarantee communicate to a voter, and that is via the ballot language. We've got in-house attorneys that work with you know, jurisdictional public attorneys as well as bond counsel. Not to go outside the bounds of legality, but to really push up right to the edge of it. Make sure that status quo isn't what's directing ballot language. We want to make sure that benefits are at the top, and that legalese can be couched, hopefully in a resolution, and to just make sure that voters understand what they're going to get and how much it's going to cost them. And then finally, TPL can help with campaigns as well. And we can get more into that if you'd like. But, you know, the regional approach is a challenging one. Obviously, the pandemic provides more challenges, but I think this is a very exciting concept, and we'd love to be part of the solution and helping you think through the various possibilities at your disposal.
Great, thanks so much. You started to address a question that came up about regional ballot measures. We'll loop back to that in the panel discussion, but for the moment, we'll go to our next presentation, which is Robin Pikes with Meridian Institute.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's great to see a lot of familiar faces, and it really feels like this group is collectively coming at this challenge from a lot of different angles. I was involved, I think it was last year, in a study for Colorado Parks and Wildlife on specific ideas for future funding. And I thought I would share with you guys some of this. We really went into detail about 9 specific funding ideas, and walk through those in a bit more detail. First, for some context, so Colorado Parks and Wildlife commissioned this study on the heels of the Future Generations Act, which raised hunting and fishing licenses and state park fees for the first time in quite a while. And in that process, I think it raised a lot of questions about why sportsman groups were supporting so much of the funding for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and what some of the specific ideas that could really engage non-sportsman groups in funding. I should also note, hold on just a second, that there are some significant long-term trends in funding and needs for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. So really thinking about that diversity of funding sources was another big part of the study. I want to sort of mention quickly that the results from the study are sort of limited by a couple big things. So we wanted to really focus on funding sources that might be a good fit for Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and especially for wildlife needs. Their biggest funding needs consistently and long-term were sort of on the wildlife side of the budget, not necessarily on the state parks budget. And we really emphasize this user pays model of funding. So we wanted to look at how people who recreate or spend time on public lands could contribute to some of the funding mechanisms. And then we've mentioned briefly the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR. So we also wanted to run all of the ideas through this filter of what are the implications of TABOR on these funding ideas. And the study sort of had 3 big parts. So we first did a literature review and looked at what other funders and state agencies, wildlife agencies, park agencies, and outdoor recreation areas are doing in other states. So this is a combination of literature, getting on the phone with people that work across different states or have faced these similar challenges in other places. We then took some of these ideas and really tested them with a lot of local stakeholders and user groups. We had an advisory group. I see a few people from that advisory group on this call today. So, but the advisory group was really intended to help us think through the study design, make connections to specific user groups, and react to early drafts of the study. And then the last thing I'll mention is we also partnered with Earth Economics to help us do a bit of a revenue generation estimate. And so tried to at least understand the magnitude, what some of the constraints are, and what the actual funding might look like from some of these funding ideas. So with that, we really focused on these 9 ideas. So we looked at some tax-based ideas, some fee-based ideas, and then a couple of angles at getting at voluntary or incentivized contributions. And I'll go through these in additional detail. For each one, we were really looking at the potential revenue generation, the political feasibility, including that TABOR filter, and then the stakeholder, and especially any implicated user groups, how they felt about this funding idea. So for taxes, we looked at 3 main ideas. General sales tax, so a few states use 1/8 of 1% of their state's sales tax that is dedicated to a specific agency. So we looked at what that could look like in Colorado. We also looked at this last one of these 3, the dedicated revenue from gear sales. This is the idea that it's similar to Pittman-Roberts or Dingell-Johnson. You could tax those currently taxed firearms and ammunition. What would a state level tax look like on outdoor gear? And then the sort of hybrid of those, this dedicated revenue from gear tax. So this is an idea that that you would take, essentially earmark the amount of revenue generated from outdoor gear sales at the state level and earmark that specifically for an agency. This was recently passed in Georgia through the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act. It was a ballot initiative, and I think it had something like 88% voter approval. Texas has a similar model, and this seemed to be have pretty good support from a lot of different groups. I will just really quickly say, I think the quick summary of taxes is Tabor makes them very challenging in the state of Colorado. Everybody, all of the stakeholders we talked to, not all of them, but many of them felt very strongly that taxes were a good way to support this. Everybody likes taxes except for taxpayers and the voting public, which of course makes it quite challenging to put in place. These options also had generated the most revenue, so they were the biggest, most long-term, stable revenue sources of the different ideas that we pursued. And I should note, oops, my slide is a little bit mixed up here, but the Outdoor Industry Association strongly opposes the new gear tax. So that is a pretty significant barrier to passing something like that at the state level or federally. It's a really big challenge there. So then we started to look, if I think that with Tabor being so problematic for taxes, many people in Colorado have then turned to fees to get a better sense of if this is another idea or mechanism for potentially funding some state priorities. So we looked at 4 specific ideas here, really sort of clustered into 3 ideas. So a vehicle registration fee, a mountain bike registration fee, or a non-motorized boat registration fee. And then what we sort of branded as the Colorado Outdoor Stamp, although I think the terminology is still up in the air, but I can sort of explain the concept in a little bit more detail. The vehicle registration fee is the idea that several states, in lieu of a state park pass, you either automatically purchase the state park pass when you go to register your vehicle, so it's mandatory, it's just built into the vehicle registration fee, but then you don't pay when you're entering a state park. There's also some states that have an opt-out version of that, and so you can, I think Montana is one of these states, you can choose to not register, to pay this state park fee as part of your vehicle registration, but you have to go to the DMV and fill out a different piece of paper that says that you're not going to pay this $10 fee. And then there's some places that have a voluntary fee, so you can essentially purchase a parks pass at the time that you're registering your vehicle. So those are some ideas related to vehicle registration. All of the cases I saw, that was pretty directly tied to parks and state park and park access. So I didn't come across any examples where that was used to fund broader conservation or public land priorities. The next 2, so mountain bike registration fee and non-motorized boat registration fee, we explored these in a lot of detail. We looked at different models, essentially looking at the current OHV registration, the current motorized boat registration, and the hunting and fishing license model, and kind of thinking through what this could look like for either mountain bike specific or like canoes and kayaks for that non-motorized boat registration fee. There was generally support from the user groups if it went back into some sort of benefit for them. So for the mountain bike registration fee, we heard a lot of the state level trail coalitions that if 90% of it or 70%, some percent to be defined, went directly into the trail maintenance, then they were on board. However, if it went to other state priorities, kind of depending on where that percent is, they may or may not support it. And then this Colorado Outdoor Stamp idea, it was really, this was like at almost every meeting, at some point someone would raise their hand and say, well, could we just come up with some sort of across the board, like $10 annual pass for all outdoor recreation users, hikers, bikers, canoers, you know, kind of across the gamut. This is, I think, a really interesting idea. There's a lot of logistics that have to be sorted out. What would it look like? How would you pay for it? How would you enforce it? Would it be voluntary? But I think it's kind of an interesting concept to kind of dive into in more detail. You'll see the revenue generation is sort of in the middle. There's some potential revenue generation, but again, a lot of it was sort of tied to user group benefits. And then the last 2 ideas that we talked about in detail was this voluntary contribution idea. So the first one is the incentivized voluntary contribution. We were wondering if maybe all of the membership-based organizations or the river guides could encourage or have an opt-out fee that would then go towards Colorado Parks and Wildlife or similar priorities. They didn't love that idea, and there was a lot of concern that any sort of voluntary contribution would generate minimal revenue, would require a lot of advertising dollars, and would not be very long-lived. The second idea that we included here was like a text message based donation, or some of the built-in app purchases that Tom mentioned. So if there's a really, there are some great CPW apps, could you have to pay more to get to the really good stuff or something like that? Again, the sort of revenue generation was, from our perspective, likely going to be minimal or short-lived. We also looked at, I wanted to throw these up there real quick for you guys. These were some of the other ideas that came up. So there's a ski pass or equipment registration fee, sports gaming tax or fee, plastic bag, statewide plastic bag fee. People really like the idea of either a real estate transfer tax or lodging transient accommodation tax, sort of somehow tying it to those types of taxes. Again, Tabor gets in the way. Trailhead fee, there's a couple of special management areas that are good examples of this trailhead fee. And then the last one was some sort of snow park or other parking pass associated with accessing the recreation areas. So I'll stop there. I just realized that the study is no longer on our website, but if you guys send me an email, I'm happy to send that out to you. I'll also send it to Julie, and if you're sending any follow-up materials, I can make sure you have that to pass on to other people.
Thanks, Robin. We've also got it in the review of readings that we sent out earlier this week.
I'm sorry, I failed to mention that up front, that we did compile those readings for folks, and whether you got to them ahead of time or saving them for later, there's some highlighted references, many pertaining to the presentations that you're hearing today as well. Okay, our final presentation today is from Becky Lineweber and with Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Association.
So PPORA, or the Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance, we have been around for about 4 years. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And you can see here our mission is to strengthen outdoor recreation for the Pikes Peak region through leadership and collaboration. And the region we're looking at is loosely the El Paso, Teller, and Fremont counties. And these are our pillars here that you can see: growing, strengthening, stewarding, advocating, and inspiring, all about outdoor recreation. The way that we have been formed is a little bit different. So, and my talk will be completely different from what you've heard about today. So talking about a community-based grassroots organization. So I just threw up on the screen here a number of our partners. And what's really key here is we are a collaboration of outdoor businesses, nonprofit organizations, land managers, and government entities. And we didn't start out that way. I mean, our initial thought was that this was going to be an outdoor business group. When we met our first meeting, we thought that, we'd have a handful of folks, and it was overwhelming. And the other pieces of the outdoor community wanted to be a part of it. And so we knew right away we had to be a big tent. And so that is what we did, because we have to, in order to get things accomplished, we needed to focus on shared goals, shared priorities, shared issues. And that broke down silos, and it's continuing to break down silos. You'll see we have the motorized community and the non-motorized community, et cetera. And at the very top of the screen, you'll see the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC and Visit Colorado Springs. These were our founding partners. And at PPORA, it's really important to tie in the business community with the tourism community, and those efforts all have to work together. So they still are very key to everything that we do. So I want to talk a little bit about our story, how we started. And I have on the top of this slide, thinking like an outdoor business, because this is really how we started at this. My husband and I own a fly fishing business. It's a retail and guide and outfitting business. And when we looked at our business and we wanted to grow fly fishing in the Pikes Peak region, we knew that we had to grow our pie. So when you look at this circle, none of it, these are not real numbers. And I just threw out, some different types of outdoor recreation just as an example, because what we recognized is in order to grow fly fishing, we needed to grow the whole pie. And when you grow the whole pie, then fly fishing becomes a bigger piece. Our piece is larger. And so through that, we expanded, and that's really why we said, let's pull people together. Let's see if we can work together on some of our common challenges, some of our common vision. And down below here, I have the word infrastructure, and I really want to bring this to you so that you think about this a little bit differently. Businesses rely on all types of infrastructure, as do communities. And the definition here are things that are needed to function properly. For an outdoor business, our outdoor lands, our public lands, our private lands, those are key infrastructure to that outdoor business. Without great access to them, without good conservation efforts, without beautiful trails and streams, then our business model falls apart. And I think when you think about that, you might think about outdoor businesses becoming key partners in the effort going forward. And so I have conservation and recreation here together because I think sometimes the idea of recreation can be more consumptive, and thinking about conservation, they seem to be opposed, but they're not. They're so integral to one another. And I'll just take a fly fishing business as an example. If I don't have a great access to trout streams that have good habitat, that have trout in them, that create great experiences, I don't have a business. And so some of your best partners are going to be these businesses that rely on these outdoor places and who are really invested in making sure that those experiences are there for future generations and future consumers and clients. Now, to think like a community. Just wanted to broaden your perspective a little bit, and the circle in the top is well-being. Health and well-being is really key to every community, and we've seen through the pandemic how important our outdoor spaces are to the well-being of our communities. We've seen the growth, and we've seen how many new users are going out because they're recognizing the mental and physical benefits of the outdoors. We also see economic growth, and I'm going to talk about that again in just a moment, is real significant to communities and workforce. That was mentioned earlier, and it's really true. All of these things go into quality of life. And so when you start thinking about how to share these priorities, that the outdoor recreation, think about what it means to the community and share it in those terms. The economic driver piece I wanted to just capitalize on. Honestly, we've been in business for over 30 years, but until the last few years, we have not captured the economic benefit of outdoor recreation in numbers. And I really credit the Outdoor Industry Association for taking the lead on this and really bringing to the focus the $887 billion in consumer spending that is the outdoor recreation economy. And this was a few years ago, so we know that that's grown since then. Usually when I share this with businesses, I share this in comparison to some other industries, automobile, oil and gas, and how this is so much larger. But even more recently, the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, came out with finally measuring our industry as an economic driver. And with the gross domestic product, this industry produces 2.2 of the US economy, and it's growing at a faster clip than the US economy overall. These things are important for your communities to know about, for them to get behind efforts in our public lands and what we need to do there. So then we started looking at, well, where are outdoor companies locating in Colorado? And although consumer spending on outdoor recreation is pretty similar across different counties, or different congressional districts, pardon me, our congressional district was very underrepresented as far as outdoor businesses. So we had a lot of spending here, not a lot of businesses. So we saw this as an opportunity. So PPORA has been very present at the outdoor retailer shows, trying to bring our Pikes Peak region into the focus of outdoor businesses who might be thinking of expanding or relocating. We want them to have us front of mind. These are just a number of things that our organization has been doing. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. State of the Outdoors. We have an annual event focused on our business community and our leadership, our city council, our legislators, because we want to bring them into this conversation and understand how important the outdoors are to them. Right below that, we have a Pikes Peak Apex Mountain Bike Challenge coming up this September. And with that, we're launching the PPORA Stewardship Fund, giving back into those trails and places, so that our community sees, although we're working on economic investment, all of it comes back here to our community. My time is running out, so I'm going to run over to the next slide. One of our biggest annual events is the Pikes Peak Outdoor Industry Leadership Summit. And this event, we're right in the middle of, because this year we had to do it virtually. So we took our normally in-person event and we broke it into two. Earlier this week, we talked about the current realities and future outlook of recreation in the region. We had our land managers addressing that. And next week, we're talking about successful strategies for sustainable outdoor recreation and tourism. And I invite you all to come. The link is here and we'll share that with you. But these are the different models that we're looking at. So PPORA in our advisory council, we have been bringing in some of these experts from other communities to share with us about their sustainable tourism and recreation models and funding plans. And so we're going to be looking at the Arkansas Headwaters Recreation Area. And if you're not familiar with that, that's an interesting model to really look at, very successful. It's managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife, but with managing agreements with other landowners along the Arkansas River corridor. The Gunnison Store Committee, right above it, is another interesting model, and they're looking at, they're generating funds with their ski industry at Crested Butte, and it's being matched by the National Forest Foundation. And then the Sustainable Tourism Plan at Sedona, this is one of the models that one of our representatives is going to be talking about. So Patsy McEntee with the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program is actually going to be looking at a number of models, and this is one of them. She's also looking at Iceland and I think 3 others that she's going to be sharing with us about. And then the final one here, Envision Chaffee County, that some on the call are very integral with, so I'm sure you know about that. But looking at what they're doing with their Recreation in Balance and their Healthy Forest Initiative. So they're going to be coming also and sharing with us. And our goal is to learn from these other models and see what we can apply to the Pikes Peak region as we look at the incredible growth we're experiencing and the high users. It's the same thing you guys are experiencing, all of us along the Front Range. But we're coming together and trying to address this. And part of it is learning from these other models, much as you are doing today with this meeting. So thank you for your time.
Wow. Gold star for right on the nose. Thank you so much, Becky.